On an ordinary winter morning in Kosovo, the city of Drenas was alive. Cars filled the streets. Shops opened their doors. Children were on their way to school. Nothing about the gray sky suggested that within hours this town would begin to vanish beneath floodwater. But far beyond the city limits, the rain had already been falling. Not for minutes, not for hours, but for days. As storm systems stalled over the Balkans, rivers across the region began to swell. What looked like steady rainfall was quietly turning into a slow-motion disaster. The Drenica River, which winds past Drenas like a harmless ribbon of water, was rising inch by inch. At first, no one noticed. Then storm drains started backing up. Puddles became pools. And suddenly water was moving where it was never meant to go. By the time people realized what was happening, it was already too late. Streets turned into channels. Cars began to float. Homes filled with muddy water. In some neighborhoods, floodwater rose several feet in a matter of hours, trapping families inside their houses as electricity went out, and cell service failed. This wasn't just a local flood. It was the collapse of an entire system. Power stations were overwhelmed. Water treatment plants shut down. Emergency crews were forced to use boats to reach people who had nowhere left to run. And as Drenas fought to survive, the same floodwaters were spreading outward, hitting other cities in Kosovo, and then surging across the border into Albania. The city that disappeared is the story of how a quiet European town was swallowed by water, and why disasters like this are becoming more common in a world where storms no longer move the way they used to. In the early hours of January 7, 2026, Drenas looked like any other small European city starting a winter day. Streets were wet from overnight rain, but traffic was moving. Shop owners lifted their shutters. Parents walked their kids to school. Life felt routine, even calm. No sirens, no emergency alerts, just another gray morning in central Kosovo. But that normality was built on a dangerous illusion. For nearly 2 days, heavy rain had been falling across western and central Kosovo, soaking the ground until it could no longer absorb another drop. Hillsides were saturated. Streams were already swollen. And the Drenica River, which runs past Drenas, was quietly rising toward a critical point. Weather forecasters had warned that the rainfall was intense, but few people expected what was coming. Unlike sudden flash floods, this disaster was slow and deceptive. The river crept upward hour by hour, pressing against its banks. Drainage systems that usually handled winter rain were already overwhelmed. Water began backing up through storm drains, pooling in low-lying streets and parking lots. Residents noticed something was off. Yards were soggy. Basements felt damp. In some neighborhoods, water began seeping into garages. Still, most people stayed. Floods were something that happened elsewhere, not here. What no one could see was that the entire watershed was now feeding into the same rivers at the same time. Every drop of rain falling miles away was heading toward Drenas. The ground had reached its limit. The river was running out of space. And by mid-morning, that quiet rise was about to turn into a surge that would change the city forever. As the morning wore on, the rain over Drenas didn't ease, it intensified. Thick gray clouds sat almost motionless over the region, dumping wave after wave of water onto an already saturated landscape. What should have been a passing winter storm became something far more dangerous, a slow-moving deluge that gave rivers no chance to recover. The Drenica River was now running high and fast, carrying muddy runoff from hills farms and towns upstream. Small creeks that normally drained into it had become raging channels of their own, pouring even more water into the system. Storm drains across the city were overwhelmed, sending water bubbling back onto the streets. What had been puddles just hours earlier were now spreading into entire blocks. By midday, emergency officials began receiving the first calls. Water was entering basements. Streets near the river were becoming impassable. Some families moved cars to higher ground. Others tried to block doorways with towels and boards, but the rain kept falling, and the river kept rising. The most dangerous part of this kind of flood is how quietly it builds. There was no single moment when everything went wrong, just a steady accumulation of water, pushing against every barrier in its path. In low-lying neighborhoods, floodwater crept up driveways and across sidewalks. Sewers backed up. The city's drainage system, designed for normal winter rain, was now completely outmatched. Upstream conditions were just as bad. Rainfall was still pounding western Kosovo, feeding every tributary that flowed into the Drenica. By the time the river reached Drenas, it was carrying far more water than it had space for. The question was no longer whether flooding would happen. It was how much of the city would be lost when the river finally broke through. The moment the Drenica River overflowed, Drenas lost the fight. What had been a rising threat suddenly became a wall of moving water. Muddy floodwater spilled over the riverbanks and rushed into nearby streets, turning roads into rivers in minutes. Cars were lifted off the pavement. Trash bins, furniture, and debris were swept along like toys. In the neighborhoods closest to the river, water surged into homes without warning. Living rooms filled. Electrical outlets sparked and went dark. Families grabbed what they could, documents, coats, children, and ran as fast as they could through knee-deep water. In some areas, the flood rose to waist height, forcing people to wade through freezing, filthy water just to reach higher ground. Main streets disappeared under several feet of floodwater. Shops were swallowed. Ground floors of apartment buildings became underwater caves. People who had waited too long were trapped inside, waving from windows or climbing onto rooftops as the water kept rising. Emergency crews tried to reach them, but many roads were already impassable. Mudslides and collapsed pavement blocked access routes. Rescue teams had no choice but to switch to boats and high-clearance vehicles, navigating what was once the center of town, like it was a lake. From above, Drenas no longer looked like a city. It looked like a floodplain. Blocks of homes were completely surrounded. Entire neighborhoods were cut off. The river had erased the boundaries between land and water. And as terrifying as it was in Drenas, the flood was not stopping there. The same rivers were rising across Kosovo, carrying this disaster toward every community downstream.
Oh my God. Man, I wish I had my filter on.
As floodwaters poured through Drenas, another disaster was unfolding beneath the surface, the collapse of the city's power grid. Rising water reached a major electrical substation on the outskirts of town, flooding critical equipment that controlled power for thousands of homes. Engineers had no choice but to shut it down to prevent explosions, fires, and deadly electrocution hazards. In seconds, entire neighborhoods went dark. Streetlights blinked off. Homes lost heat. Cell towers switched to backup power. In flooded areas, people who had already been forced out of their homes were now navigating in near-total darkness, guided only by the glow of emergency vehicles and flashlights. For families trapped on upper floors, the sudden blackout added a new layer of fear. No lights, no working elevators, and no way to charge their phones. Hospitals and emergency centers switched to generators, but even those were at risk. Fuel deliveries were delayed by flooded roads, and technicians had to wade through water to keep systems running. Every piece of infrastructure was now vulnerable. Without electricity, pumping stations that normally moved water away from low-lying areas stopped working. That meant floodwater drained more slowly, or not at all. What could have been temporary flooding became standing water that continued to spread. The blackout also affected communication. Internet and mobile networks became unreliable. People could no longer easily call for help or receive updates. In a modern city, losing power doesn't just mean losing light, it means losing connection, information, and coordination. Drenas was now fighting two disasters at once: water rising from below and a citywide blackout cutting off its ability to respond. And as the storm continued, even more critical systems were about to fail.
Your gutters tore off too.
As Drenas struggled in the darkness, another invisible crisis was unfolding: the collapse of its clean water supply. Floodwaters had surged into the Iber-LePont canal system, carrying mud, debris, and sewage into the water that feeds treatment plants across the region. At the Shkabaj water treatment plant, sensors detected dangerously high turbidity levels, making it impossible to safely filter and disinfect the water. Operators made the only decision they could: shut the system down. For tens of thousands of people in Drenas, Fushe, Kosove, Obilik, and parts of Pristina, taps ran dry or delivered water that could no longer be trusted. Authorities warned residents to boil any water they had before drinking, cooking, or washing. In flooded neighborhoods, people were already surrounded by dirty water. Now even their drinking supply was in danger. This was no longer just a flood. It was a public health emergency. Without clean water, hospitals struggled to maintain hygiene. Families couldn't safely wash their hands or prepare food. Bottled water became a lifeline, but flooded roads made deliveries difficult. In some areas, people lined up for hours just to get a few gallons of safe water. Up north in Mitrovica, the same canal system was also affected, forcing officials to suspend water service there as well. The impact of one flooded river had rippled across an entire region. Floods destroy buildings, but when they contaminate water, they threaten lives long after the rain stops. And in Drenas, that invisible danger was now spreading just as fast as the floodwaters themselves.
Big time hail. Look at the parking lot.
What happened in Drenas was not just a flood, it was the collapse of an entire system. First the river broke in, then the power went out, then the clean water disappeared. In a matter of hours, a modern European town was pushed back into survival mode, where every light, every phone call, and every glass of water suddenly mattered. And this disaster didn't stop at one city. The same floodwaters spread across Kosovo and into Albania, forcing evacuations, shutting down roads, and putting entire regions on emergency footing. When rivers rise this high, borders don't matter. Only gravity does. If this story helped you understand how fragile our infrastructure really is, please hit like, share this video, and subscribe, so more people can see what happens when systems fail under extreme weather. Every share helps raise awareness that could save lives. Now we want to hear from you. If a flood like this hit your city tomorrow, do you think your power, water, and emergency systems would hold, or would they collapse the same way Drenas did?